The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 2. Many such women could be saints because they felt divinity closer to them than hands and feet. The medieval imagination was so stimulated by all the forces of word, picture, statue, ceremony, even by the color and quantity of light, that supersensory visions came readily, and the believing soul felt itself breaking through the bounds of nature to the supernatural. The human mind itself, in all the mystery of its power, seemed a supernatural and unearthly thing, surely akin to a blurred image and infinitesimal fraction of the mind behind and in the matter of the world. So the top of the mind might touch the foot of the throne of God. In the ambitious humility of the mystic, the hope burned that a soul unburdened of sin and uplifted with prayer might rise on the wings of grace to the beatific vision and a divine companionship. That vision could never be attained through sensation, reason, science, or philosophy, which were bound to time, the many, and the earth, and could never reach to the core and power and oneness of the universe. The problem of the mystic was to cleanse the soul as an internal organ of spiritual perception, to wash away from it all stain of selfish individuality and illusory multiplicity, to widen its reach and love to the uttermost inclusion, and then to see with clear and disembodied sight that the cosmic, eternal, and divine, and thereby to return, as from a long exile, to union with the God from whom birth had meant a penal severance. Had not Christ promised that the pure in heart would see God? Mystics, therefore, appeared in every age, every religion, and every land. Greek Christianity abounded in them despite the Hellenic legacy of reason. St. Augustine was a mystic fountain for the West. His confessions constituted a return of the soul from created things to God. Seldom had any mortal so long conversed with the deity. St. Anselm, the statesman, St. Bernard, the organizer, upheld the mystical approach against the rationalism of Rosselin and Abélard. When William of Champeaux was driven from Paris by the logic of Abélard, he founded in a suburb in 1108 the Augustinian Abbey of St. Victor as a school of theology, and his successors there, Hugh and Richard, ignoring the perilous adventure of young philosophy, based religion not on argument but on the mystical experience of the divine presence. Hugh, who died in 1141, saw supernatural sacramental symbols in every phase of creation. Richard, who died in 1173, rejected logic and learning, preferred the heart to the head, à la Pascal, and described with learned logic the mystical rise of the soul to God. The Passion of Italy kindled mysticism into a gospel of revolution. Joachim of Florida, Giovanni de Gioacchini di Fiori, a noble of Calabria, developed a longing to see Palestine. Impressed on the way by the misery of the people, he dismissed his retinue and continued as a humble pilgrim. Legend tells how he passed an entire Lent in an old well on Mount Tabor, how on Easter Sunday a great splendor appeared to him and filled him with such divine light that he understood at once all the scriptures, all the future, and all the past. Returning to Calabria, he became a Cistercian monk and priest, thirsted for austerity, and retired to a hermitage. Disciples gathered, and he formed them into a new order of Flora, whose rule of poverty and prayer was approved by Celestin III. In 1200 he sent to Innocent III a series of works which he had written, he said under divine inspiration, but which nevertheless he submitted for papal censorship. 2 years later he died. His writings were based on the Augustinian theory, widely accepted in Orthodox circles, that a symbolic concordance existed between the events of the Old Testament and the history of Christendom from the birth of Christ to the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Joachim divided the history of man into 3 stages. The first, under the rule of God the Father, ended at the Nativity. The second, ruled by the Son, would last, according to apocalyptic calculations, 1260 years. The third, under the Holy Ghost, would be preceded by a time of troubles, of war and poverty and ecclesiastical corruption, and would be ushered in by the rise of a new monastic order which would cleanse the Church and would realize a worldwide utopia of peace, justice, and happiness. Thousands of Christians, including men high in the Church, accepted Joachim's claim to divine inspiration and looked hopefully to 1260 as the year of the Second Advent. The spiritual Franciscans, confident that theirs was the new order, took courage from Joachim's teachings. And when they were outlawed by the Church, they carried on their propaganda through writings published under his name. In 1254, an edition of Joachim's main works appeared under the title of The Everlasting Gospel, with a commentary proclaiming that a pope tainted with simony would mark the close of the Second Age, and that in the Third Age the need of sacraments and priests would be ended by the reign of universal love. The book was condemned by the Church. Its presumptive author, a Franciscan monk, Gerardo da Borga, was imprisoned for life, but its circulation secretly continued and deeply affected mystical and heretical thought in Italy and France, from St. Francis to Dante, who placed Joachim in paradise. Perhaps in excited expectation of the coming kingdom, a mania of religious penitence flared up around Perugia in 1259 and swept through northern Italy. Thousands of penitents of every age and class marched in disorderly procession, dressed only in loincloths, weeping, praying God for mercy, and scourging themselves with leather thongs. Thieves and usurers fell in and restored their illegal gains. Murderers, catching the contagion of repentance, knelt before their victims' kin and begged to be slain. Prisoners were released, exiles were recalled, enmities were healed. The movement spread through Germany into Bohemia, and for a time it seemed that a new and mystical faith, ignoring the Church, would inundate Europe. But in a little while the nature of man reasserted itself. New enmities developed, sinning and murder were renewed, and the flagellant craze disappeared into the psychic recesses from which it had emerged. The mystic flame burned less fitfully in Flanders. A priest of Liège, Lambert le Bègue, that is, the stutterer, established in 1184 on the Meuse a house for women who, without taking monastic vows, wished to live together in small semi-communistic groups, supporting themselves by weaving wool and making lace. Similar Maisons Dieu, or houses of God, were established for men. The men called themselves Begards, the women Beguines. These communities, like the Waldenses, condemned the Church for owning property and themselves practiced a voluntary poverty. A similar sect, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, appeared about 1262 in Augsburg and developed in the cities along the Rhine. Both movements claimed a mystical inspiration which absolved them from ecclesiastical control, even from state or moral law. State and Church combined to suppress them. They went underground, emerged repeatedly under new names, and contributed to the origin and fervor of the Anabaptists and other radical sects in the Reformation. Germany became the favorite land of mysticism in the West. Hildegard of Bingen, from 1099 to 1179, the Sibyl of the Rhine, lived all but 8 of her 82 years as a Benedictine nun, and ended as abbess of a convent on the Rupertsberg. She was an unusual mixture of administrator and visionary, pietist and radical, poet and scientist, physician and saint. She corresponded with popes and kings, always in a tone of inspired authority, and in Latin prose of masculine power. She published several books of visions, or scivias, for which she claimed the collaboration of the deity. The clergy were chagrined to hear it, for these revelations were highly critical of the wealth and corruption of the Church. Said Hildegard in accents of eternal hope, "Divine justice shall have its hour. The judgments of God are about to be accomplished. The empire and the papacy, sunk into impiety, shall crumble away together. But upon their ruins shall appear a new nation. The heathen, the Jews, the worldly, and the unbelieving shall be converted together. Springtime and peace shall reign over a regenerated world, and the angels will return with confidence to dwell among men." A century later, Elizabeth of Thuringia, from 1207 to 1231, aroused Hungary with her brief life of ascetic sanctity. Daughter of King Andrew, she was married at 13 to a German prince, was a mother at 14, a widow at 20. Her brother-in-law despoiled her and drove her away penniless. She became a wandering pietist, devoted to the poor. She housed leprous women and washed their wounds. She too had heavenly visions, but she gave them no publicity and claimed no supernatural powers. Meeting the fiery inquisitor Conrad of Marburg, she was morbidly fascinated by his merciless devotion to orthodoxy. She became his obedient slave. He beat her for the slightest deviation from his concept of sanctity. She submitted humbly, inflicted additional austerities upon herself, and died of them at 24. Her reputation for saintliness was so great that at her funeral half-mad devotees cut off her hair, ears, and nipples as sacred relics. Another Elizabeth entered the Benedictine nunnery of Schonau, near Bingen, at the age of 12 in 1141, and lived there till her death in 1165. Bodily infirmities and extreme asceticism generated trances in which she received heavenly revelations from various dead saints, nearly all anti-clerical. "The Lord's vine has withered," her guardian angel told her. "The head of the church is ill, and her members are dead. Kings of the earth, the cry of your iniquity has risen even to me." Toward the end of this period, the mystic tide ran high in Germany. Meister Eckhart, born about 1260, would come to his ripe doctrine in 1326, to his trial and death in 1327. His pupils Suso and Tauler would continue his mystic pantheism. And from that tradition of unecclesiastical piety would flow one source of the Reformation. Usually the Church bore patiently with the mystics in her fold. She did not tolerate serious doctrinal deviations from the official line, or the anarchic individualism of some religious sects. But she admitted the claim of the mystics to a direct approach to God, and listened with good humor to saintly denunciations of her human faults. Many clergymen, even high dignitaries, sympathized with the critics, recognized the shortcomings of the Church, and wished that they too could lay down the contaminating tools and tasks of world politics, and enjoy the security and peace of monasteries fed by the piety of the people and protected by the power of the Church. Perhaps it was such patient ecclesiastics who kept Christianity steady amid the delirious revelations that periodically threatened the medieval mind. As we read the mystics of the 12th and 13th centuries, it dawns upon us that orthodoxy was often a barrier to contagious superstitions, and that in one aspect the Church was belief, as the state was force, organized from chaos into order to keep men sane. 7. The Tragic Pope. When Gregory X came to the papacy in 1271, the Church was again at the summit of her power. He was a Christian as well as a pope, a man of peace and amity, seeking justice rather than victory. Hoping to regain Palestine by one united effort, he persuaded Venice, Genoa, and Bologna to end their wars. He secured the election of Rudolph of Habsburg as emperor, but soothed with courtesy and kindness the defeated candidates. And he reconciled Guelph and Ghibelline in factious Florence and Siena, saying to his Guelph supporters, "Your enemies are Ghibellines, but they are also men, citizens, and Christians." He summoned the prelates of the Church to the Council of Lyons in 1274. 1,570 leading churchmen came. Every great state sent a representative. The Greek emperor sent the heads of the Greek Church to reaffirm its submission to the Roman See. Latin and Greek churchmen sang together a Te Deum of joy. Bishops were invited to list the abuses that needed reform in the Church. They responded with startling candor, and legislation was passed to mitigate these evils. All Europe was magnificently united for a mighty effort against the Saracens. But on the way back to Rome, Gregory died in 1276. His successors were too busy with Italian politics to carry out his plans. Nevertheless, when Boniface VIII was chosen pope in 1294, the papacy was still the strongest government in Europe, the best organized, the best administered, the richest in revenue. It was the misfortune of the Church that at this juncture, nearing the end of a virile and progressive century, the mightiest throne in Christendom should have fallen to a man whose love of the Church and sincerity of purpose were equaled by his imperfect morals, his personal pride, and his tactless will to power. He was not without charm. He loved learning and rivaled Innocent III in legal training and wide culture. He founded the University of Rome and restored and extended the Vatican Library. He gave commissions to Giotto and Arnolfo di Cambio and helped finance the amazing facade of Orvieto Cathedral. He had prepared his own elevation by persuading the saintly but incompetent Celestine V to resign after a pontificate of 5 months, an unprecedented act that surrounded Boniface with ill will from the start. To scotch all plans for a restoration, he ordered the 80-year-old Celestine to be kept in detention in Rome. Celestine escaped, was captured, escaped again, wandered for weeks through Apulia, reached the Adriatic, attempted a crossing to Dalmatia, was wrecked, was cast ashore in Italy, and was brought before Boniface. He was condemned by the Pope to imprisonment in a narrow cell at Ferentino, and there, 10 months later, he died in 1296. The temper of the new pope was sharpened by a succession of diplomatic defeats and costly victories. He tried to dissuade Frederick of Aragon from accepting the throne of Sicily. When Frederick persisted, Boniface excommunicated him and laid an interdict upon the island, this in 1296. Neither king nor people paid any heed to these censures, and in the end Boniface recognized Frederick. To prepare for a crusade, he ordered Venice and Genoa to sign a truce. They continued their war for 3 years more, and rejected his intervention in making peace. Failing to secure a favorable order in Florence, he placed the city under interdict and invited Charles of Valois to enter and pacify Italy in 1300. Charles accomplished nothing, but won the hatred of the Florentines for himself and the Pope. Seeking peace in his own papal states, Boniface had attempted to settle a quarrel among the members of the powerful Colonna family. Pietro and Jacopo Colonna, both cardinals, repudiated his suggestions. He deposed and excommunicated them in 1297, whereupon the rebellious nobles affixed to the doors of Roman churches and laid upon the altar of St. Peter's a manifesto appealing from the Pope to a general council. Boniface repeated the excommunication, extended it to 5 other rebels, ordered their property confiscated, invaded the Colonna domain with papal troops, captured its fortresses, razed Palestrina to the ground, and had salt strewn over its ruins. The rebels surrendered, were forgiven, revolted again, were again beaten by the warrior pope, fled from the papal states, and planned revenge. Amid these Italian tribulations, Boniface was suddenly confronted by a major crisis in France. Philip IV, resolved to unify his realm, had seized the English province of Gascony. Edward I had declared war, this in 1294. Now, to finance their struggle, both kings decided to tax the property and personnel of the Church. The popes had permitted such taxation for crusades, but never for a purely secular war. The French clergy had recognized their duty of contributing to the defense of the state that protected their possessions, but they feared that if the power of the state to tax were unchecked, it would be a power to destroy. Philip had already reduced the role of the clergy in France. He had removed them from the manorial and royal courts, and from their old posts in the administration of the government and in the council of the king. Disturbed by this trend, the Cistercian order refused to send Philip the fifth of their revenues which he had asked for the war with England, and its head addressed an appeal to the Pope. Boniface had to move carefully, for France had long been the chief support of the papacy in the struggle with Germany and the Empire. But he felt that the economic basis of the power and freedom of the Church would soon be lost if she could be shorn of her revenues by state taxation of church property without papal consent. In February 1296 he issued one of the most famous bulls in ecclesiastical history. Its first words, Clericis Laicos, gave it a name, its first sentence made an unwise admission, and its tone recalled the papal bolts of Gregory VII. Antiquity reports that laymen are exceedingly hostile to the clergy, and our experience certainly shows this to be true at present. With the counsel of our brethren and by our apostolic authority, we decree that if any clergy shall pay to laymen any part of their income or possessions without the permission of the Pope, they shall incur excommunication. And we also decree that all persons of whatever power or rank, who shall demand or receive such taxes, or shall seize or cause to be seized the property of churches or of the clergy, shall incur excommunication. Philip, for his part, was convinced that the great wealth of the Church in France should share in the costs of the state. He countered the papal bull by prohibiting the export of gold, silver, precious stones, or food, and by forbidding foreign merchants or emissaries to remain in France. These measures blocked a main source of papal revenue, and banished from France the papal agents who were raising funds for a crusade in the East. In the bull Ineffabilis Amor, September 1296, Boniface retreated. He sanctioned voluntary contributions from the clergy for the necessary defense of the state, and conceded the right of the king to be the judge of such a necessity. Philip rescinded his retaliatory ordinances. He and Edward accepted Boniface, not as pope but as a private person, as arbitrator of their dispute. Boniface decided most of the issues in Philip's favor. England yielded for the moment, and the three warriors enjoyed a passing peace. Perhaps to replenish the papal treasury after the decline of receipts from England and France, perhaps to finance a war for the recovery of Sicily as a papal fief, and another war to extend the papal states into Tuscany, Boniface proclaimed 1300 as a jubilee year. The plan was a complete success. Rome had never in its history seen such crowds before. Now, apparently for the first time, traffic rules were enforced to govern the movement of the people. Boniface and his aides managed the affair well. Food was brought in abundantly and was sold at moderate prices, papally controlled. It was an advantage for the Pope that the great sums so collected were not earmarked for any special purpose, but could be used according to his judgment. Despite half-victories and severe defeats, Boniface was now at the crest of his curve. In the meantime, however, the Colonna exiles were entertaining Philip with tales of the Pope's greed, injustice, and private heresies. A quarrel arose between Philip's aides and a papal legate, Bernard Cessé. The legate was arrested on a charge of inciting to insurrection. He was tried by the royal court, convicted, and committed to the custody of the Archbishop of Narbonne in 1301. Boniface, shocked by this summary treatment of his legate, demanded Cessé's immediate release and instructed the French clergy to suspend payment of ecclesiastical revenues to the state. In the bull Ausculta Fili, Listen, Son, December 1301, he appealed to Philip to listen modestly to the Vicar of Christ as the spiritual monarch over all the kings of the earth. He protested against the trial of a churchman before a civil court and the continued use of ecclesiastical funds for secular purposes, and he announced that he would summon the bishops and abbots of France to take measures for the preservation of the liberties of the Church, the reformation of the kingdom, and the amendment of the king. When this bull was presented to Philip, the Count of Artois snatched it from the hands of the Pope's emissary and flung it into the fire, and a copy destined for publication by the French clergy was suppressed. Passion was inflamed on both sides by the circulation of two spurious documents, one allegedly from Boniface to Philip, demanding obedience even in temporal affairs, the other from Philip to Boniface informing thy very great fatuity that in temporal things we are subject to no one. And these forgeries were widely accepted as genuine. On February 11, 1302, the bull Ausculta Fili was officially burned at Paris before the king and a great multitude. To forestall the ecclesiastical council proposed by Boniface, Philip summoned the three estates of his realm to meet at Paris in April. At this first States General in French history, all three classes, nobles, clergy, and commons, wrote separately to Rome in defense of the king and his temporal power. Some 45 French prelates, despite Philip's prohibition and the confiscation of their property, attended the council at Rome in October 1302. From that council issued the bull Unam Sanctam, which made arrestingly specific the claims of the papacy. There is, said the bull, but one true church, outside of which there is no salvation. There is but one body of Christ, with one head, not two. That head is Christ and his representative, the Roman Pope. There are two swords or powers, the spiritual and the temporal. The first is borne by the church, the second is borne for the church by the king, but under the will and sufferance of the priest. The spiritual power is above the temporal, and has the right to instruct it regarding its highest end, and to judge it when it does evil. We declare and define and pronounce, concluded the bull, that it is necessary for salvation that all men should be subject to the Roman pontiff. Philip replied by calling two assemblies, in March and June of 1303, which drew up a formal indictment of Boniface as a tyrant, sorcerer, murderer, embezzler, adulterer, sodomite, simoniac, idolater, and infidel, and demanded his deposition by a general council of the Church. The king commissioned William of Nogaret, his chief legist, to go to Rome and notify the Pope of the king's appeal to a general council. Boniface, then in the papal palace at Anagni, declared that only the Pope could call a general council, and prepared a decree excommunicating Philip and laying an interdict upon France. Before he could issue it, William of Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna, heading a band of 2,000 mercenaries, burst into the palace, presented Philip's message of notification, and demanded the Pope's resignation. This on September 7, 1303. Boniface refused. A tradition of considerable trustworthiness says that Sciarra struck the pontiff in the face and would have killed him had not Nogaret intervened. Boniface was 75 years old, physically weak but still defiant. For 3 days he was kept a prisoner in his palace while the mercenaries plundered it. Then the people of Anagni, reinforced by 400 horsemen from the Orsini clan, scattered the mercenaries and freed the Pope. Apparently his jailers had given him no food in the 3 days, for standing in the marketplace he begged, "If there be any good woman who would give me an alms of wine and bread, I would bestow upon her God's blessing and mine." The Orsini led him to Rome and the Vatican. There he fell into a violent fever, and in a few days he died on October 11, 1303. His successor, Benedict XI, from 1303 to 1304, excommunicated Nogaret, Sciarra, Colonna, and 13 others whom he had seen breaking into the palace at Anagni. A month later, Benedict died at Perugia, apparently poisoned by Italian Ghibellines. Philip agreed to support Bertrand de Goux, Archbishop of Bordeaux, for the papacy if he would adopt a conciliatory policy, absolve those who had been excommunicated for the attack upon Boniface, allow an annual income tax of 10% to be levied upon the French clergy for 5 years, restore the Colonnas to their offices and property, and condemn the memory of Boniface. We do not know how far Bertrand consented. He was chosen pope, and took the name of Clement V in 1305. The cardinals warned him that his life would be unsafe in Rome. And after some hesitation, and perhaps a pointed suggestion from Philip, Clement removed the papal seat to Avignon, on the east bank of the Rhone just outside the southeastern boundary of France, this in 1309. So began the 68 years of the Babylonian captivity of the popes. The papacy had freed itself from Germany and surrendered to France. Clement, against his weak will, became the humiliated tool of the insatiable Philip. He absolved the king, restored the Colonna family, withdrew the bull Clericis Laicos, allowed the spoliation of the Templars, and finally, in 1310, consented to a post-mortem trial of Boniface by an ecclesiastical consistory at Grosseau, near Avignon. In the preliminary examinations held before the Pope and his commissioners, 6 ecclesiastics testified to having heard Boniface, a year before his pontificate, remark that all supposedly divine laws were inventions of men to keep the common people in good behavior through fear of hell, that it was fatuous to believe that God was at once one and three, or that a virgin had borne a child, or that God had become a man, or that bread could be changed into the body of Christ, or that there was a future life. So I believe, and so I hold, as doth every educated man. The vulgar hold otherwise. We must speak as the vulgar do, and think and believe with the few. So these 6 quoted Boniface, and 3 of them, later re-examined, repeated their testimony. The prior of Saint-Gilles at San Gimino reported that Boniface, as Cardinal Gaetani, had denied the resurrection of either body or soul, and several other ecclesiastics confirmed this testimony. One ecclesiastic quoted Boniface as saying of the consecrated host, "It is mere paste." Men formerly belonging to the household of Boniface accused him of repeated sexual sins, natural and unnatural. Others accused the supposed skeptic of attempting magical communication with the powers of darkness. Before the actual trial could be held, Clement persuaded Philip to leave the question of Boniface's guilt to the coming Ecumenical Council of Vienne. When that council met in 1311, 3 cardinals appeared before it and testified to the orthodoxy and morality of the dead pope. 2 knights, as challengers, threw down their gauntlets to maintain his innocence by wager of battle. No one accepted the challenge, and the council declared the matter closed. 8. Retrospect. The testimony against Boniface, true or false, reveals the undercurrent of skepticism that was preparing to end the age of faith. Likewise, the blow, physical or political, given Boniface VIII at Anagni, marks in one sense the beginning of modern times. It was the victory of nationalism against supernationalism, of the state against the church, of the power of the sword over the magic of the word. The papacy had been weakened by its struggle against the Hohenstaufens, by the failure of the Crusades. France and England had been strengthened by the collapse of the empire, and France had been enriched by acquiring Languedoc with the help of the church. Perhaps the popular support given to Philip IV against Boniface VIII reflected public resentment of the excesses of the Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusade. Some of Nogaret's ancestors, it was said, had been burned by the inquisitors. Boniface had not realized, in undertaking so many conflicts, that the weapons of the papacy had been blunted by overuse. Industry and commerce had generated a class less pious than the peasantry. Life and thought were becoming secularized. The laity was coming into its own. For 70 years now, the state would absorb the church. Looking back over the panorama of Latin Christianity, we are impressed above all by the relative unanimity of religious faith among diverse peoples, and the overspreading hierarchy and power of the Roman Church, giving to Western Europe, non-Slavic, non-Byzantine Europe, a unity of mind and morals such as it has never known again. Nowhere else in history has an organization wielded so profound an influence over so many men for so long a time. The authority of the Roman Republic and Empire over its immense realm endured from Pompey to Alaric, 480 years. That of the Mongol Empire, or the British Empire, some 200 years. But the Roman Catholic Church was the dominant force in Europe, from the death of Charlemagne in 814 to the death of Boniface VIII in 1303, 489 years. Her organization and administration do not appear to have been as competent as that of the Roman Empire, nor was her personnel as capable or cultured as the men who governed the provinces and cities for the Caesars. But the Church inherited a barbarous bedlam, and had to find a laborious way back to order and education. Even so, her clergy were the best instructed men of the age, and it was they who provided the only education available in Western Europe during the 5 centuries of her supremacy. Her courts offered the justest justice of her time. Her papal curia, sometimes venal, sometimes incorruptible, constituted in some degree a world court for the arbitration of international disputes and the limitation of war. And though that court was always too Italian, the Italians were the best-trained minds of those centuries, and any man could rise to membership in that court from any rank and nation in Latin Christendom. Despite the chicanery usually accompanying collective human power, it was good that above the states and kings of Europe there should be an authority that could call them to account and moderate their strife. If any world state was to be, what could seem fitter than that its seat should be the throne of Peter, whence men, however limited, could see with a continental eye and from the background of centuries? What decisions could be more peaceably accepted, or could be more easily enforced, than those of a pontiff revered as the vicar of God by nearly all the population of Western Europe? When Louis IX left on crusade in 1248, Henry III of England made extreme demands upon France and prepared to invade. Pope Innocent IV threatened England with interdict should Henry persist, and Henry refrained. The power of the Church, said the skeptical Hume, was a rampart of refuge against the tyranny and injustice of kings. The Church might have realized the high conception of Gregory VII, might have made her moral power supreme over the physical forces of the states, had she used her influence only for spiritual and moral purposes, and never for material ends. When Urban II united Christendom against the Turks, the dream of Gregory was almost realized. But when Innocent III, Gregory IX, Alexander IV, and Boniface VIII gave the holy name of crusade to their wars against the Albigensians, Frederick II, and the Colonnas, the great ideal broke to pieces in papal hands stained with Christian blood. Where the Church was not threatened, she responded with considerable tolerance for diverse, even heretical views. We shall find an unexpected freedom of thought among the philosophers of the 12th and 13th centuries, even among professors at universities chartered and supervised by the Church. All that she asked was that such discussions should be confined and intelligible only to the educated, and should not take the form of revolutionary appeals to the people to abandon their creed or the Church. The Church, says her most industrious recent critic, as it embraced the whole population, embraced also every type of mind, from the most superstitious to the most agnostic, and many of these unorthodox elements worked far more freely under the cloak of outward conformity than is generally supposed. All in all, the picture that we form of the medieval Latin Church is that of a complex organization doing its best, despite the human frailties of its adherents and its leaders, to establish moral and social order, and to spread an uplifting and consoling faith amid the wreckage of an old civilization and the passions of an adolescent society. The 6th century Church found Europe a flotsam of migratory barbarians, a babel of tongues and creeds, a chaos of unwritten and incalculable laws. She gave it a moral code buttressed with supernatural sanctions strong enough to check the unsocial impulses of violent men. She offered it monastic retreats for men, women, and classic manuscripts. She governed it with episcopal courts, educated it with schools and universities, and tamed the kings of the earth to moral responsibility and the tasks of peace. She brightened the lives of her children with poetry, drama, and song, and inspired them to raise the noblest works of art in history. Unable to establish a utopia of equality among unequally able men, she organized charity and hospitality, and in some measure protected the weak from the strong. She was, beyond question, the greatest civilizing force in medieval European history. Chapter 30. The Morals and Manners of Christendom, 700 to 1300. 1. The Christian Ethic. Man in the jungle or hunting stage had to be greedy, to seek food eagerly and gorge himself zealously, because when food came he could not be sure when it would come again. He had to be sexually sensitive, often promiscuous, because a high death rate compelled a high birth rate. Every woman had to be made a mother whenever possible, and the function of the male was to be always in heat. He had to be pugnacious, ever ready to fight for food or mate. Vices were once virtues, indispensable to survival. But when man found that the best means of survival for individual as well as species was social organization, he expanded the hunting pack into a system of social order in which the instincts, once so useful in the hunting stage, had to be checked at every turn to make society possible. Ethically, every civilization is a balance and tension between the jungle instincts of men and the inhibitions of a moral code. The instincts without the inhibitions would end civilization. The inhibitions without the instincts would end life. The problem of morality is to adjust inhibitions to protect civilization without enfeebling life. In the task of moderating human violence, promiscuity, and greed, certain instincts, chiefly social, took the lead and provided a biological basis for civilization. Parental love in beast and man created the natural social order of the family, with its educative discipline and mutual aid. Parental authority, half a pain of love and half a joy of tyranny, transmitted a life-saving code of social conduct to the individualistic child. The organized force wielded by chieftain, baron, city, or state circumscribed and largely circumvented the unorganized force of individuals. Love of approval bent the ego to the will of the group. Custom and imitation guided the adolescent, now and then, into ways sanctioned by the trial and error experience of the race. Law frightened instinct with the specter of punishment. Conscience tamed youth with the detritus of an endless stream of prohibitions. The Church believed that these natural or secular sources of morality could not suffice to control the impulses that preserve life in the jungle but destroy order in a society. Those impulses are too strong to be deterred by any human authority that cannot be everywhere at once with awesome police. A moral code bitterly uncongenial to the flesh must bear the seal of a supernatural origin, if it is to be obeyed. It must carry a divine sanction and prestige that will be respected by the soul in the absence of any force, and in the most secret moments and coverts of life. Even parental authority, so vital to moral and social order, breaks down in the contest with primitive instincts unless it is buttressed by religious belief inculcated in the child. To serve and save a society, a religion must oppose to insistent instinct no disputable man-made directives, but the undebatable categorical imperatives of God himself. And those divine commandments, so sinful or savage is man, must be supported not only by praise and honor bestowed for obeying them, nor only by disgrace and penalties imposed for violating them, but also by the hope of heaven for unrequited virtue and the fear of hell for unpunished sin. The commandments must come not from Moses, but from God. The biological theory of primitive instincts unfitting man for civilization was symbolized in Christian theology by the doctrine of original sin. Like the Hindu conception of karma, this was an attempt to explain apparently unmerited suffering. The good endured evil here because of some ancestral sin. In Christian theory, the whole human race had been tainted by the sin of Adam and Eve. Said Gratian's Decretum, circa 1150, unofficially accepted by the Church as her teaching, "Every human being who is conceived by the coition of a man with a woman is born with original sin, subject to impiety and death, and therefore a child of wrath." And only divine grace and the atoning death of Christ could save him from wickedness and damnation. Only the gentle example of the martyred Christ could redeem man from violence, lust, and greed, and save him and his society from destruction. The preaching of this doctrine, combined with natural catastrophes that seemed unintelligible except as punishments for sin, gave many medieval Christians a sense of inborn impurity, depravity, and guilt, which colored much of their literature before 1200. Thereafter, that sense of sin and fear of hell diminished till the Reformation, to reappear with fresh terror among the Puritans. Gregory I and later theologians spoke of 7 deadly sins. pride, avarice, envy, anger, lust, gluttony, and sloth, and opposed to them the 7 cardinal virtues, 4 natural or pagan virtues praised by Pythagoras and Plato, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, and 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. But though accepting the pagan virtues, Christianity never assimilated them. It preferred faith to knowledge, patience to courage, love and mercy to justice, abstention and purity to temperance. It exalted humility and ranked pride, so prominent in Aristotle's ideal man, as the deadliest of the deadly sins. It spoke occasionally of the rights of man, but it stressed rather the duties of man, to himself, his fellow man, his church, and God. In preaching a gentle Jesus meek and mild, the Church had no fear of making men effeminate. On the contrary, the men of medieval Latin Christendom were more masculine because they met more hardships than their modern beneficiaries and heirs. Theologies and philosophies, like men and states, are what they are because in their time and place they have to be. 2. Premarital morality. How far did medieval morality reflect or justify medieval ethical theory? Let us first look at the picture with no thesis to prove. The first moral incident of the Christian life was baptism. The child was solemnly inducted into the community and the church and was vicariously subjected to their laws. Every child received a Christian name, that is, usually the name of some Christian saint. Surnames, that is, added names, were of motley origin and could go back through generations to kinship, occupation, place, a feature of body or character, even a bit of church ritual. Cicely Wilkins' daughter, James Smith, Margaret Ferrywoman, Matthew Paris, Agnes Redhead, John Merriman, Robert Litany, Robert Benedicite, or Benedict. Gregory the Great, like Rousseau, urged mothers to nurse their own infants. Most poor women did, most upper-class women did not. Children were loved as now, but were beaten more. They were numerous, despite high infantile and adolescent mortality. They disciplined one another by their number and became civilized by attrition. They learned 100 arts of the country or the city from relatives and playmates, and grew rapidly in knowledge and wickedness. "Boys are taught evil as soon as they can babble," said Thomas of Celano in the 13th century, "and as they grow up they become steadily worse until they are Christians only in name." But moralists are bad historians. Boys reached the age of work at 12 and legal maturity at 16. Christian ethics followed, with adolescence, a policy of silence about sex. Financial maturity, the ability to support a family, came later than biological maturity, the ability to reproduce. Sexual education might aggravate the pains of continence in this interval, and the Church required premarital continence as an aid to conjugal fidelity, social order, and public health. Nevertheless, by the age of 16, the medieval youth had probably sampled a variety of sexual experiences. Pederasty, which Christianity had effectively attacked in late antiquity, reappeared with the Crusades, the influx of Oriental ideas, and the unisexual isolation of monks and nuns. In 1177, Henry, abbot of Clairvaux, wrote of France that ancient Sodom is springing up from her ashes. Philip the Fair charged that homosexual practices were popular among the Templars. The penitentials, ecclesiastical manuals prescribing penances for sins, mentioned the usual enormities, including bestiality. An astonishing variety of beasts received such attentions. Where amours of this sort were discovered, they were punishable with the death of both participants, and the records of the English Parliament contain many cases of dogs, goats, cows, pigs, and geese being burned to death with their human paramours. Cases of incest were numerous. Premarital and extramarital relations were apparently as widespread as at any time between antiquity and the 20th century. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.